The case was officially closed before the victim's family had even finished asking questions. Police called it an accident. The paperwork was completed. The investigation ended, and everyone was expected to move on. But years later, a single discovery would force people to ask a disturbing question. What if the case had never been an accident at all? What if the truth had been buried before anyone had the chance to find it? The victim was Daniel Mercer. By all accounts, Daniel lived a quiet life. He worked a steady job, had close friends, maintained regular contact with family. Nothing about his life suggested he was in danger. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Authorities received reports that a vehicle had left the road and crashed down an embankment near a remote stretch of highway. Emergency responders arrived quickly. Inside the vehicle, they found Daniel. He was dead. Within hours, investigators announced their preliminary conclusion. The crash appeared to be accidental. A tragic loss. Nothing more. The official explanation seemed simple. Daniel had apparently lost control of the vehicle. The car left the roadway. The impact caused fatal injuries. Case closed, or so it seemed. Daniel's family immediately felt something wasn't right. Not because they were unwilling to accept the loss, but because certain details didn't make sense. For starters, Daniel was known as a careful driver. Friends described him as almost overly cautious. He rarely sped, rarely took risks, and according to those closest to him, he had no reason to be driving in that area at all. The location was miles away from his usual routes. When family members asked investigators about it, they received vague answers. Nothing concrete, nothing helpful, just reassurances that the evidence supported the official conclusion. Yet the questions continued. A few days later, Daniel's brother visited the crash site. What he found only increased his suspicions. There were very few skid marks, almost none. For a driver supposedly losing control of a vehicle, the scene looked strangely clean. No obvious attempts to brake. No signs of sudden correction. Nothing suggesting panic. He photographed everything. At the time, nobody paid much attention. Years later, those photographs would become extremely important. The investigation moved quickly. Too quickly, according to some. Witnesses were interviewed. Reports were filed. The death certificate was issued. Then the case was closed, officially classified as an accident. The family felt they had been given no real opportunity to challenge the conclusion. And slowly life moved on, at least on the surface. But Daniel's mother never accepted the explanation. She spent years collecting documents, police reports, photographs, medical records, anything connected to the case. She kept everything organized inside several boxes stored in her home. Most people assumed she was simply struggling with grief. Then something unexpected happened. A retired investigator reviewed the case after hearing about it from a mutual acquaintance. At first, he expected nothing unusual. Accidental crashes happen every day. But the more he examined the documents, the more uncomfortable he became. Several details stood out immediately. One report described damage to the vehicle that appeared inconsistent with the official reconstruction. Another mentioned evidence that was never fully explained. Then there were witness statements. Statements that seemed to contradict each other. Some had been included in the final file. Others appeared to have been largely ignored. The investigator became convinced that important questions had never been properly answered. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Buried inside old records was a statement from a witness who had never testified publicly. According to that witness, another vehicle had been seen near Daniel's car shortly before the crash. Not behind him, not ahead of him, beside him. The witness described the vehicles traveling unusually close together, almost as if they were interacting. Yet the statement received little attention during the original investigation. Why? Nobody seemed able to explain. The retired investigator continued digging. The deeper he looked, the stranger the story became. Phone records showed Daniel had received several calls shortly before his death. Calls that investigators never appeared to fully examine. The contents remained unknown, but their timing raised questions, especially because Daniel had reportedly appeared worried in the days leading up to the crash. Friends later recalled unusual conversations. Daniel had mentioned dealing with a problem, a situation he wasn't ready to discuss. When asked for details, he changed the subject. No one thought much of it at the time. After his death, those conversations became difficult to ignore. Then another detail emerged. One of Daniel's co-workers recalled seeing him involved in a heated discussion with an unidentified man shortly before the accident. The argument appeared serious, intense. Yet investigators never identified the individual. The lead went nowhere, or at least, that's what the record suggested. Years later, some began wondering whether anyone had truly followed up at all, and that question would soon become even more important. As interest in the case resurfaced, independent researchers began examining the original evidence. Some believed the inconsistencies were innocent mistakes. Others suspected something far more troubling. What they all agreed on was this: the investigation had moved remarkably fast, faster than many comparable cases, and nobody could explain why. The breakthrough came when modern forensic specialists reviewed photographs of a vehicle. Using updated analysis techniques, they identified damage patterns that raised serious concerns. Certain marks suggested the possibility of contact with another vehicle before the crash. Not proof, but enough to challenge the official narrative. If true, the implications were enormous, because the accident might not have been an accident at all. Public interest exploded. Journalists began requesting records. Former investigators were interviewed. Experts weighed in. For the first time in years, the case was receiving widespread attention. And with that attention came new witnesses. One individual claimed to have seen two vehicles stopped along the roadside shortly before the crash occurred. Another reported hearing an argument. Neither statement could be fully verified, but both added to growing doubts surrounding the original conclusion. Then came one of the most controversial discoveries. A section of documentation appeared to be missing from the official archive. Not classified, not restricted, simply absent. No clear explanation existed. Some argued the records had been misplaced. Others suspected something more deliberate. The missing material immediately fueled speculation. What had been removed? And why? No one could answer. As investigators re-examined Daniel's final days, a clearer picture began to emerge. He had been under pressure. Not financial pressure. Not family pressure. Something else. Several acquaintances independently described him as distracted, concerned, preoccupied with an issue he refused to explain. One friend recalled Daniel saying, "If something happens to me, don't believe the first explanation." At the time, it sounded dramatic. After everything that followed, it sounded chilling. The statement could never be independently confirmed, but it spread rapidly once made public. For many observers, it became symbolic of the entire mystery, because the first explanation was exactly what authorities had provided: an accident, nothing more. And yet years later, that explanation seemed increasingly fragile. The family pushed for further review. Legal requests were filed. Experts were consulted. Public pressure continued to grow. But reopening a closed case is never simple, especially when so much time has passed. Memories fade. Evidence deteriorates. Witnesses disappear. Every year that passes makes the truth harder to find. Yet despite those obstacles, questions remain. Questions that refuse to go away. Why was the case closed so quickly? Why were conflicting statements given so little attention? Why were certain leads never fully explored? Why did so many details seem to point in different directions? And perhaps most importantly, was someone simply trying to solve a routine case as efficiently as possible? Or was someone trying to make sure certain questions were never asked? To this day, there is no definitive answer. Officially, Daniel Mercer's death remains classified as an accident. No one has been charged. No alternative explanation has been proven. No court has declared wrongdoing. But the doubts remain. And with every new review, those doubts seem to grow. Some believe the inconsistencies are exactly what they appear to be: human error, a rushed investigation, nothing more. Others believe the case represents something darker, a truth hidden beneath incomplete reports, overlooked evidence, and unanswered questions. The problem is that both possibilities remain plausible, and until new evidence emerges, certainty may never be possible. What happened on that road? Why was Daniel there? Who was in the second vehicle described by the witness? What information may have been overlooked? And why did so many people feel the case was closed before it had truly been investigated? Those questions continue to haunt everyone connected to the story, because sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not the ones with impossible clues. They're the ones where the answers may have been right there from the beginning, and someone simply chose not to look. If you enjoyed this story and want more unsolved mysteries, suspicious investigations, and true crime cases, make sure to follow and subscribe.